Greetings, traveller of time. Imagine the light slowly fading over the Abbey of Saint-Grégoire, a sturdy Benedictine monastery nestled in the lands of Aquitaine around the 11th century, as the sun sinks beyond the horizon in a palette of sepia and deep burgundy. I'm but an old historian. If sleep finds you, I'll be glad. But tell me, from which corner of the world have you come to me? It's the twilight of a long day, and the cold stone of the corridors already exhales the damp freshness of the coming night. A silent invitation to the introspection that marks monastic life, with every toll of the bell calling for vespers. Its grave sound rolls across the surrounding fields, where the scent of freshly cut hay mingles with the earthy fragrance of the nearby forest. The young monk, whose name was Theodore, had barely reached 20. His blue eyes, once bright, now carried the weight of sleepless vigils and a quiet inner battle, a war of whispers and fleeting images that invaded his mind precisely during the hours meant for meditation and prayer. He walked slowly through the cloister, head bowed, the faint sound of his sandals against the stone floor breaking the stillness of dusk. The chill rising from the ground touched his skin, contrasting with the gentle warmth of the candle in his hand, its small flame flickering with each soft breeze and casting long, dancing shadows across the massive columns supporting the gallery. Life in the abbey followed the rhythm of the bell and the rule of Saint Benedict, a code of conduct that shaped every hour of the day, from matins before dawn to compline before sleep. Each brother was expected to maintain purity, not only in action, but also in thought, a task that, for Theodore, often felt impossible. His lips moved in silent prayer, repeating psalms to drive away the unwanted visions that colored his imagination. Images the church condemned as fruits of the devil or the weakness of flesh. The effort to repress them left him tense, his hands clenched beneath the wide sleeves of his habit. He knew he had to confess his torment to his superior, Father Silvestre, an older man with a serene face whose fine wrinkles seemed like traces of patience and deep spiritual wisdom. Yet shame kept Theodore from stepping forward, even as he lingered at the doorway of the father's cell, where a soft light spilled through a small parchment-covered window. The fear of being judged weak or unworthy of the habit weighed on him almost as much as the thoughts themselves. He remembered childhood tales of tempter demons who invaded the minds of the devout, using their most human desires to lead them astray, stories that only deepened his unease. As he waited for courage, Theodore paused near the scriptorium, where the sweet scent of new parchment and gallnut ink drifted through the cold air, an aroma of devotion and knowledge that briefly soothed him. It's worth noting that during the Middle Ages, monks didn't only pray or work in the fields. They were also the keepers of learning, copying and illuminating manuscripts under harsh conditions, with little warmth and poor light, a demanding task that embodied both physical and spiritual discipline. Theodore admired this deeply, though he often felt its weight pressing on his shoulders. The pursuit of mental purity was one of the pillars of monastic spirituality, an ongoing attempt to imitate the Desert Fathers, who centuries earlier had withdrawn from the world to face temptation head-on. Many medieval theologians believed that sinful thoughts were the first step towards sinful acts, making the mind a crucial battlefield for the soul's salvation. Each fleeting image felt like defeat to Theodore, a subtle blow to his vocation, and he would spend hours kneeling, whispering Kyrie eleison, feeling the biting chill of the stone floor seep through his thin habit. It was a small, voluntary penance meant to quiet his restless mind, yet relief never lasted long, and the cycle of anguish soon began again. Life in seclusion, though meant to shield one from temptation, often made it stronger. An idle mind, or one too fixated on its own vigilance, became fertile ground for intrusive thoughts. The rigid doctrine that linked pleasure and sin so tightly turned natural impulses into sources of crushing guilt. He recalled a recent sermon about the sin of acedia, not just laziness, but spiritual weariness, a kind of holy boredom that could lead to distraction and temptation. Theodore feared that his struggle to keep focus might be a sign of this dangerous acedia, a deeper flaw of spirit. Finally, with a pounding heart and a dry throat, Theodore gathered his courage and gently knocked on Father Silvestra's wooden door. The old man greeted him with a warm smile and a calm gesture to sit, offering a small bench lined with sheepskin, softer than his own seat, a quiet act of kindness. The cell was simple, a wooden crucifix on the wall, a rolled parchment on a worn table, yet it radiated a deep peace that instantly eased the young monk's nerves. Father Silvestre spoke in a low, steady voice, almost like a murmur meant to soothe. He told Theodore to speak without fear, reminding him of God's mercy, greater than any human weakness. His tone was like cool water dripping on hot stone, dissolving some of the tension wound tight inside the young man. And so Theodore began to unburden himself, describing the invasion of images and desires that haunted him, especially during long silences and meager meals. Each word lightened his heart, though shame still burned on his cheeks, proof of both his honesty and his devotion. Silvestre listened without interruption, his calm expression unchanging, his gaze steady and thoughtful, the look of a man who had heard such confessions countless times before. He nodded slowly, eyes fixed on some invisible point beyond Theodore, as if consulting a wisdom older than the walls around them. He knew that youth and isolation were a cauldron for these struggles, and that harsh repression could be more dangerous than humble discipline. He began with a gentle reminder of humility, that Theodore was flesh and blood, not an angel, and that struggle was proof of faith, not its failure. Sin, he said, did not lie in the thought itself, but in giving it consent, in dwelling on it, in feeding it. The monk's instinct to drive it away with prayer was already an act of virtue, a quiet victory. The young man's guilt began to soften, replaced by a sense of resolve. Then Father Silvestre spoke of penance not as punishment, but as medicine. The body, he explained, was the vessel of the soul, and training it helped the spirit grow stronger. He advised Theodore to add an extra day of fasting each week, taking only bread and water, a physical reminder of dependence on God, and a way to bring his thoughts back to the present moment. He also encouraged more night vigils, hours spent awake in the cold chapel before the crucifix, lit only by a flickering oil lamp. The chill of winter nights, he said, would sharpen the spirit, transforming discomfort into focus. To trade rest for prayer was a form of devotion, a way to show God the depth of one's commitment. From a drawer, Father Silvestre took out a simple leather cilice, a small cord with knots, and handed it to Theodore. He explained that gentle self-discipline, used privately and with humility, could serve as a tactile reminder of Christ's passion. It wasn't about pain, but about awareness, a whisper to bring wandering thoughts back to grace. Used wisely, it could keep pride and indulgence at bay. Mental discipline, he continued, also depended on physical work, tasks that kept the hands busy, copying manuscripts, tending the garden, or shaping wood, left little room for wandering thoughts. The rough feel of timber, the damp soil between the fingers, even the smell of manure in the fields, all of it grounded a monk in the present and in service, shielding him from dangerous daydreams. This harmony of prayer and labor, ora et labora, was the backbone of the Benedictine way. Reading, too, was a weapon. Filling the mind with scripture and the lives of saints left no space for temptation. The mind, Silvestre said, can't remain empty. If the good doesn't dwell in it, the bad will. Daily reading and memorization of holy passages built what he called an inner fortress, strong and serene against sinful thoughts, a method practiced for centuries. He urged Theodore to confess regularly, not only for absolution, but as a way to disarm the power of shame. Speaking aloud what tormented him stripped those thoughts of secrecy, letting light and reason dissolve their hold. Confession, he said, is a gentle exorcism, a way to cast out what hides in silence. He promised Theodore that his door would always be open, day or night, should the struggle return, a vow that rekindled hope in the young monk's heart. There was, Silvestre added, a crucial difference between temptation and complacency. Temptation came unbidden, a knock at the door, but complacency was when one invited it in. Theodore was to watch his thoughts carefully, to notice the very moment they arose and cut them off with a brief prayer or the sign of the cross before they could take root. Spiritual vigilance, he said, was the key to freedom. The old priest also offered a touch of historical realism. In the medieval world, temptation wasn't seen as purely spiritual. Many believed it could also stem from physical imbalances, too much blood or bile, as the humoral physician said. It was, in a sense, both moral and medical. That idea, though outdated, brought Theodore a subtle comfort. Maybe his burden wasn't a moral failure, but a human one, something that could be eased through care, diet, or even herbal remedies. He mentioned a simple custom among monks, washing one's face or hands in cold water when temptation grew strong. The shock of cold served as a physical jolt, forcing the mind back to the present, breaking the cycle of intrusive thoughts. It was an ascetic trick, a way of using the body itself as an ally against the imagination. Finally, Father Silvestre offered an image. "Your soul," he said softly, "is like a walled garden. The thoughts that drift into it are seeds carried by the wind. You can't stop the wind, but you can choose which seeds to pull and which to let grow." The metaphor placed the power back in Theodore's hands, not as a burden, but as a calling. Every prayer, every fast, every small victory was another stone in the wall, another flower blooming in his inner garden. As the last light of day faded into deep blue twilight, Father Silvestre rose and placed a gentle hand on Theodore's shoulder. The young monk's tension had softened. That simple human touch felt like warmth and blessing, a reminder that he wasn't alone. Silvestre told him to begin the practices right away, with humility, not despair, and to return soon to share his progress. "Each step," he said, "is a triumph in God's eyes." Theodore inhaled the faint scent of old incense lingering in the cell. He bowed in gratitude, his chest lighter, his heart steadier. The struggle ahead no longer felt like a curse, but a path, a quiet pilgrimage toward peace. Stepping back into the cloister, he found the moon rising full and silver above the courtyard, bathing the columns in ethereal light. The silence of the night stretched before him, solemn, vast, and sacred, a new beginning for prayer, and perhaps for redemption. Theodore began his new discipline the next morning, feeling a subtle difference in the air and in his own posture, a change that came less from the monastery itself and more from his newly awakened will to actively defend his mind against quiet intrusion. He knew the battle started with the first hour of the day, when the body is most vulnerable and the soul is still struggling to fully wake. He rose well before the usual hour of Lauds, feeling the cold wood under his bare feet, and made his way to the chapel, where the world was still half dark. The oil lamp by the altar glowed like a single point of warmth in a wide ocean of shadow, and the pre-dawn air bit at his skin with a clean, cutting chill that kept him alert and focused. The practice of keeping vigil at dawn, trading the comfort of sleep for the effort of prayer quickly proved to be a powerful antidote to acedia and to the wandering thoughts that used to come to him in moments of rest. The need to focus on the Latin words of the Psalms, whispering so softly that he wouldn't break the silence of the sleeping abbey, became an exercise in mental control that demanded everything he had. He spent long minutes on his knees, hands folded tightly and eyes fixed on the crucifix, letting the image of the Passion replace any unwanted fantasy. He turned the discomfort of kneeling in the cold into an offering, a quiet act of solidarity with redemptive suffering, and from that a strange, deep calm would rise in him. Throughout the day, the extra fast that Father Silvestre had prescribed left his stomach feeling light and hollow, but also reminded him of his smallness and his dependence. At Sext, around midday, when the smell of fresh bread drifted from the abbey kitchen, warm, alive, almost sweet, he felt the pull of hunger like a hook, but refusing that comfort on purpose changed the emptiness into purification. It was a way of denying the body what it wanted, so the soul could grow steadier. This was a central idea in medieval ascetic practice: weaken the flesh to weaken the temptations that come from it. And strangely, that physical hunger helped quiet the hungers of his imagination. He also began spending more hours in the scriptorium. The focus required to copy sacred texts with precision and beauty left no room for drifting thoughts. He lost himself in the rhythm of quill against parchment, in the faint, scratching sound of ink meeting prepared skin, in the mingled scent of wax, glue, and gall ink. The work of copying a single manuscript could take months, sometimes years. It wasn't just labor, it was considered manual prayer. Drawing and coloring the decorated initials felt like a kind of stillness in motion, and the attention to detail pulled his mind toward divine order and out of private unrest. For that reason, in Benedictine life, the scriptorium wasn't only a workplace, it was a place of protection. It's interesting to note that medieval monasteries were built to shape the mind. The square cloister with its inner garden wasn't only practical, it carried spiritual meaning. The cloister was understood as a symbol of paradise, an ordered space set apart from the chaos of the world. To walk slowly around it, step after measured step, was itself a meditation on divine harmony. During pauses in his day, Theodore would walk the cloister and trail his fingers along the rough stone of the wall. The slightly gritty feel under his fingertips grounded him. It pulled him back into the present moment and away from the ghosts in his imagination. Father Silvestre watched him from a distance. He noticed the new paleness in the young monk's face, the natural result of fasting and shortened sleep, but he also noticed a steadier light in his eyes. He understood something essential. The true battle wasn't against the thoughts themselves, but against the shame they produced. Peace, in the monastic sense, didn't come from never being tempted. It came from not condemning oneself for being tempted. Life in the abbey wasn't the destruction of instinct. It was the redirection of instinct toward love and devotion, and that, to Silvestre, was already a sign of grace in Theodore. In one of his later confessions, Theodore admitted that even simple daily work could stir up memories and distractions. Washing the kitchen tools, for instance, surrounded by steam and the heavy smell of fat, ash soap, and boiled broth, sometimes pulled him back to moments from before he'd taken the habit, memories he didn't want. Father Silvestre smiled gently and told him a brief story about an old monk who, when assailed by temptation in the kitchen, would pick up a cold piece of charcoal and squeeze it hard in his palm. The dull ache in his hand and the dry, powdery feel of soot against his skin became a physical reminder of the fire he wished to avoid, the fire of damnation. It was a sensory interruption, a way to use the body itself to call the mind back to obedience. That simple, almost practical little story taught Theodore something important. He could use his senses to defend himself. He didn't have to fight in the abstract. He could anchor himself with touch, smell, temperature, sound. From that day on, when temptation surfaced, he would reach for the rough rope belt tied at his waist and rub it between his fingers. The coarse fibers, the tight knot, the scratch of tension against his skin, that tiny physical signal pulled him back to his vow, to his purpose, to the discipline he had chosen. His regular confessions with Father Silvestre became more than ritual. They became a kind of cleansing. Each time he spoke aloud the thoughts he feared most, they lost a little of their power. Once exposed to light, to reason, to mercy, they no longer felt like a secret force inside him. Silvestre never scolded him. Instead, he calmly offered short prayers for Theodore to repeat the instant something intrusive appeared, showing him how to answer temptation quickly with a counter-thought. It was, in truth, a kind of mental training, the quiet core of medieval ascetic life. Trying to reach peace of mind felt to Theodore like trying to wipe a mirror while a fine mist kept settling over it. It demanded constant effort. But little by little, he noticed something shift. What had once felt like defeat started to feel like merit. The priest had told him, perfect purity of thought doesn't exist in this life. The real victory isn't never thinking anything wrong. The real victory is refusing to give consent, refusing to welcome the thought, dwell in it, enjoy it. He began to see himself less as failing and more as standing watch, like a sentry guarding the wall of his own city. The abbey itself, with its unchanging routines and thick stone walls, slowly stopped feeling like a place of restriction and began to feel like shelter. The warm smell of beeswax and old incense in the chapel wrapped around him like a veil. He started to understand that community was medicine. Shared work, common prayer, familiar footsteps in the hallway. All of this quietly protected him from the kind of isolation where the mind can turn against itself. Serving others pulled his attention outward, away from the tight circle of his own anxieties. It's also worth noting how medieval medicine understood these struggles. Monks and physicians in that period often explained anxiety, obsessive thoughts, and even impure mental images as symptoms of too much black bile or melancholia. The cure, according to that worldview, involved adjusting diet and using certain bitter herbs to rebalance the humors. Crude as it sounds now, it carried a kind of mercy. It suggested that temptation wasn't always pure moral failure. Sometimes it was also physical imbalance. Following Father Silvestre's advice, Theodore avoided rich or heavily seasoned foods for a while, and he did notice a slight lift in his mood and a little more clarity in his thinking. That small improvement encouraged him to keep trusting the path of discipline. Even so, the practice that demanded the most courage from him was wearing the cilice. He kept it under his habit, a simple cord with small knots that pressed against his skin. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't meant for display. It was a private, steady discomfort that reminded him that his body was not his master. Real penance, he had learned, wasn't something to be shown. It was something offered quietly to God, witnessed only by God and by the spiritual guide who watched over him. That understanding protected him from spiritual vanity, a very real danger in any severe form of devotion. Gradually, he noticed that the intrusive thoughts didn't stop existing, but they stopped ruling him. They didn't throw him into the same panic. They didn't leave him drowning in shame. He began to see them the way one sees passing clouds, something that moves across the sky of the mind but doesn't stay unless invited. This was progress. He realized that true freedom wasn't, "I will never feel this again," but "this no longer decides who I am." In that shift, guilt gave way to mercy, and mercy brought quiet. By evening, when the candles were lit in the refectory and in the cells, and the sweet smell of beeswax drifted through the halls, Theodore often found a moment of stillness. He would look out at the cloister under the rising moon, everything washed in silver light, and feel linked to centuries of men and women who had fought the same inner battles in silence. He no longer saw himself as weak or cursed. He began to see himself as a spiritual soldier, part of a long line of souls who understood that holiness is not a sudden state, but a path of discipline, surrender, and grace. At the end of the week, Father Silvestre called him back to his cell and greeted him with quiet affection. He noticed the subtle change in the young monk's bearing, the clearer steadiness in his gaze. He praised him, not for being free of temptation, but for how firmly he met it. Perseverance, he told him, is what reveals true faith. Then he warned him not to become too harsh with himself. God, he said, loves moderation. Discipline without joy can turn into pride, and pride can rot even good efforts. The goal of all this isn't suffering. The goal is love. The abbey's soundscape, the low murmur of Gregorian chant in the chapel, the soft tapping of tools in the scriptorium, the distant splash and echo of the well bucket, became a cord of safety around Theodore. He learned to use those sounds like anchors. When his mind tried to wander, he would listen on purpose. He'd listen to now. That practice of returning again and again to the present moment and to the shared life around him felt like a kind of prayer too, a grounded, almost physical prayer. He often remembered something Father Silvestre liked to repeat. God's path isn't easy, but it's gentle. Theodore held on to that. The difficulty, he realized, lived in the discipline he had to impose on himself. The gentleness lived in God's mercy and in the acceptance of his own humanity. Holding both at once, effort and tenderness, he was beginning to understand, the only way to survive spiritually in the rigor of monastic life. In the medieval world, the fight against sinful thoughts wasn't seen as an isolated struggle, but as a lifelong war that defined the Christian journey, especially for those in religious life. The Church, through spiritual guides and sacramental practice, offered a full arsenal: prayer, fasting, confession, work. Victory wasn't measured by, "I was never tempted," but by, "I stayed faithful while I was tempted." Theodore absorbed this way of seeing himself. It gave him purpose and belonging. He was no longer alone in his difficulty. He was standing in the same stream as the saints. The weight of shame, which had once bent his shoulders, slowly gave way to a quiet humility. He began to recognize the same hidden struggle in the other monks, in their silences, their lowered eyes, the way they carried themselves. The pain of discipline wasn't a sign of personal failure. It was something they all shared. That realization bound him to them in a deeper way. Even the cold air of the cloister, which had first felt unfriendly, now felt cleansing. He could smell the faint green of the herbs growing in the inner garden, a living freshness rising from within stone, and he understood it as a small promise that renewal could exist even inside hardship. The last image he carried with him that night was Father Silvestre's face, calm, steady, almost luminous in its quiet. It was proof that inner peace wasn't a fantasy. It could be reached through discipline, through mercy, and through time. Holding that image close, Theodore went to the scriptorium. The candlelight flickered over the parchment in front of him, and the soft scratch of the quill began again, steady and patient. Work and prayer, line after line. It had become his anchor. It had become his rest. The morning sun was already spreading a gentle warmth across the polished stones of the courtyard, but a thin veil of mist still clung to the valleys around the abbey. Light and shadow shared the landscape, and that contrast felt like a mirror of Theodore's inner struggle as he worked in the garden, turning the damp, dark soil with his hands protected by rough leather gloves. The hoe struck the earth in a steady rhythm, dull, repetitive, almost soothing, occupying the most instinctive part of his mind and keeping it from wandering. The rich smell of wet earth and manure rose around him, an honest and rustic scent that anchored him in the physical world. It felt like prayer with the hands, just as necessary as prayer with the tongue, as the rule taught. The first thing becoming clear in his new discipline was the power of rhythm, the unchanging cadence of monastic duty that acted like a natural antidote to mental disorder. When the mind is required to follow a predictable sequence, prayer, work, study, meal, it finds structure, and that structure resists chaos. With each pull of the hoe, he felt strain in his shoulders and arms, a useful kind of fatigue that reminded him his body existed for a purpose larger than satisfying its own impulses. That physical tiredness quieted the louder cravings of the flesh. As he worked, Theodore thought about something monks and preachers in the Middle Ages often used: artificial memory. It was a technique in which you organize thoughts by placing them in physical locations, almost like walking through an inner building. A person could store complex ideas by imagining them set in specific rooms or corners. He tried to adapt this to his struggle. He pictured Father Silvestra's cell as the place of peace and confession, and the scriptorium as the place of holiness. He imagined a place of discard, where he would send the images he didn't want, replacing them with the solid architecture of faith. It was a high-effort exercise in mental control, and it demanded focus from him in a way that simple repression never had. This method, using the abbey's physical layout as a map for his thoughts, became another layer of discipline. It wasn't just fasting and wakefulness anymore, it was spatial discipline, visual discipline. He gripped the wooden handle of the hoe and felt how cold and slightly damp it was against his palm. That tiny sensation reminded him, "I'm here, I'm working, I'm present." It brought him back to the now before his mind could slip off into dangerous daydreams. There was a quiet wisdom in that, a wisdom built into the strict rhythm of cloistered life. He listened deliberately to the light crumble of turned soil, the soft scrape and thud of earth. That sound blended with birdsong from the edge of the forest. Together they formed a kind of gentle music that wrapped the abbey in serenity, the exact opposite of the turmoil he so often felt inside. Tending the garden, he realized, wasn't just a chore. Historically, monasteries like theirs were often close to self-sufficient. Farm work wasn't only survival, it was humility, and it was considered ascetic in itself. Working the land was a way of remembering. We depend on labor, on the seasons, on what is given and what is taken. That awareness calmed him. In the distance, he saw Father Silvestra walking slowly toward the chapel. The older monk's brown habit stood out against the pale stone and green grass, a figure of quiet authority, steady and composed. Theodore felt a wave of gratitude just looking at him. Silvestra paused, glanced his way, and gave him a small, wordless nod. It wasn't praise exactly, but it was acknowledgement. That simple gesture warmed him more than the sun did. It gave his effort the feeling of offering, not punishment. As the morning went on, the mist burned off. The air grew warmer and drier. Theodore pulled off his gloves for a moment and pressed his bare fingers into the soil. It was cool, grainy, alive. That direct contact reminded him that he was made of earth too, that he was, quite literally, dust given breath, and that his path wasn't about hating the body, but about teaching it to serve something beyond itself. The repetition of manual work felt like a quiet mystery, effort and harvest, fall and renewal. It echoed the rhythm in his soul, sin, penance, forgiveness. And it gave him hope that what he was cultivating inside himself might also bear fruit in time. The Benedictine Abbey of Saint-Grégoire was its own small world. It had its own herb store, its own workshop, its own library. That self-sufficiency is a striking historical detail. Monasteries weren't only places of prayer, but also local centers of economy, craft, and even medicine. They preserved agricultural techniques, copied books, treated the sick, taught, advised. Knowing this gave Theodore a sense that his work mattered beyond his private salvation. Every vegetable planted and every manuscript copied helped sustain not just the monastery, but the region. That sense of usefulness was powerful. It kept boredom and self-absorption, two of the great doors to temptation, at a distance. Even so, he noticed that temptation hadn't vanished. During communal prayer, when Gregorian chant filled the chapel and the voices of the brothers blended into one solemn line of sound, stray thoughts still tried to slip in. They came like whispers behind the melody. He had to make a conscious effort to keep his attention on the rhythm of the chant, on the pronunciation of the Latin. By the end of long hours in choir, he felt mentally exhausted, but that exhaustion felt clean. It was different from shame. It meant he had struggled instead of surrendering. His struggle had, more and more, a physical language. The smell of incense rising in the chapel, the cold bite of holy water against his fingertips, the hard pressure of the kneeler beneath his knees. He began to treat each of these sensations like a rope he could grab when his mind threatened to drift. Over time, he realized something important. The rituals of monastic life, the objects, the movements, the sounds, weren't decoration. They were tools, shaped over centuries to train the body and steady the mind. They were, in their own way, spiritual technology. Later that day, while helping Brother Gautier in the refectory, Theodore felt the heavy, pleasant warmth coming off the wood stove. The air was filled with the comforting smell of simmering vegetables and herbs. It was humble food, simple and honest. He noticed the worn wooden bowls and spoons, the plain table settings, the frugality of every portion. It reminded him that this was a life of renunciation, not dramatic, theatrical renunciation, but daily, quiet, practical renunciation. Serving others and not taking more than he was allowed felt like a small victory over the ego. Brother Gautier, older, broad-shouldered, always with a patient half-smile and hands thickened by decades of work, leaned toward him. Keeping his voice low so as not to break the customary silence of the meal, he whispered that God's mercy can also be found in moderation. Too much zeal, he warned, can lead to illness and to pride. The body is not an enemy to be destroyed, he said softly. It's a vessel to be cared for. That gentle reminder, coming not from a theologian but from a fellow worker, eased something in Theodore. It softened the edge of his self-judgment. It told him that charity had to include charity toward himself. He began to understand that the serenity he admired in Father Silvestre and in Brother Gautier didn't come from a lack of struggle. It came from accepting struggle as part of the life of the soul. That realization unsettled him at first, then humbled him. He saw that his early obsession with absolute purity had secretly carried pride, the idea that, by force of will alone, he might achieve perfection. True penance, he now understood, wasn't the attempt to become flawless. It was the surrender of pride. It was letting himself be shaped. That afternoon, during the period set aside for reading and study in the scriptorium, he copied and reflected on a passage from an early church father about the 8 evil thoughts, the spiritual ancestors of what would later become known as the 7 deadly sins. The text said that lust often feeds on gluttony and sloth, that link Desire, excess, idleness made sense to him. It confirmed the wisdom of his fasting and his manual labor. Medieval theology, for all its severity, offered him something practical. It named the chain, and once something has a name and a shape, it's less terrifying. You can face it. Life in common, he realized, was one of his greatest protections. The shared routine, the mutual discipline, the constant presence of his brothers, all of it fought the isolation in which shame grows strongest. The rough feel of another monk's sleeve brushing his own during prayer. The soft, steady sound of breathing in the dormitory at night. These small details reminded him he wasn't alone. He belonged to something larger than his private fear. That sense of belonging itself began to heal him. At the end of the day, he joined Compline, the last prayer of the night, carrying both physical tiredness and a kind of mental quiet he hadn't felt in a long time. The final hymn, the Salve Regina, rose around him like a slow blessing. The chapel was almost entirely dark now, lit only by the altar candles. The air had turned cool and thin with night, and that chill felt like an invitation to withdraw fully into silence. For the first time in a long while, his mind felt still. His soul felt lighter. He stayed kneeling a bit longer after the others, following Father Silvestra's instruction. Silently, he repeated the short prayer he'd been given, the one meant to reject temptation the instant it appeared. He was retraining his reflex. Instead of collapsing into guilt or panic, he was learning to answer with faith and resistance. Confession, repeated honestly, had weakened the secret power of shame. Discipline, practiced steadily, had strengthened his will. He could feel the difference now, not as a dramatic revelation, but as a lighter weight inside his own chest. There was a gentle mystery in this kind of spiritual struggle. Even the desire to keep fighting wasn't entirely his own achievement. It was grace moving in him. That understanding brought him face to face with teachings on grace and predestination in a way that was no longer abstract. His strength wasn't just self-control, it was also gift. That realization protected him from slipping back into pride, the pride of the ascetic who believes he's saving himself alone. He started to think of himself as soft clay in a careful hand. The shaping could hurt, but the shaping had meaning. When he left the chapel and walked back down the stone corridor toward his cell, he felt the night air cutting through the passageway. The cold no longer felt hostile. It felt honest. It was simply part of the world, part of his training, part of his life. That shift in interpretation from punishment to presence might have been the most important change of all. He was beginning to accept sensation without panic, without judgment. That was real progress. He lay down on his simple straw mattress and pulled the coarse wool blanket over himself. It wasn't luxurious, but it held a steady warmth. He closed his eyes and listened to the sounds of the abbey at night. A distant dog's bark, the faint rush of wind along the eaves, the deep quiet of the cloister settling into sleep. Those sounds melted into one slow line of calm, and for once they carried him toward rest without disturbance. This first step into stricter discipline, guided by Father Silvestra's gentle wisdom, was already reshaping him. He was no longer just a tormented young monk. He was becoming a spiritual fighter, not by denying his humanity, but by offering it. He had found in the rhythm of the monastery, in manual work, and in regular confession, the steady pillars he needed to protect his soul from the assaults of his own imagination. And the stillness he had always admired in the elders had begun quietly to appear in him too. That, in itself, felt like hope. He understood now that purification wasn't a single violent act of repression. It was slow work, patient work, a lifelong re-education of the mind and a careful training of the body. It was spiritual gardening. You keep turning the soil, you keep pulling the weeds, even knowing the wind will always carry in new seeds. That way of living brought him peace. The simplicity of faith and the complexity of the human mind met together in the confessor's cell, and the answer always was the same: humility, discipline, and grace. He held on to that truth with everything he had. Theodore's routine began to include something new, something Father Silvestre had quietly encouraged. He started practicing a kind of micro-observation, studying his own patterns of thought. He stopped treating his mind as an enemy to be crushed and began treating it like a garden to be mapped, watched, and tended. He tried to notice where the unwanted thoughts were getting in. For example, the scent of incense in the chapel, a warm, resinous sweetness rising in slow curls of smoke, was supposed to lift him toward contemplation. But sometimes, instead, it pulled him back to memories of feast days and lively street processions from his youth. When that happened, he had to do active work to reclaim the smell, to assign it a sacred meaning again. It became an exercise in sensory retraining. He also began to use sound as a shield against mental drift. He didn't focus only on the Gregorian chant itself, but on its echo, the way the voices reverberated off the stone walls of the chapel and came back in layers. That soft, enveloping resonance filled so much inner space that other thoughts had nowhere to form. The slow repetition of the chant, its steady sameness, did something to him. Paradoxically, its monotony was powerful. It drew him into a state of quiet attention, a kind of sonic meditation that lifted him out of his private turmoil and connected him to something beyond himself. There was another detail of medieval worship that he began to love: the piscina, the small stone basin near the altar where the priest washed his hands during Mass. That physical act, water over fingers, water running down stone, was a ritual of purification. For Theodore, it became an image of his own process, the need to wash and wash again what clung to the soul. The shock of the cold water, the soft dripping afterward, the faint mineral scent, all of it reminded him that purification wasn't a single dramatic victory. It was something ongoing. You kept coming back to it. You stayed watchful. He found himself studying the older monks with new respect. He noticed the worn texture of their habits, thinned and rubbed smooth at the sleeves. He noticed the deep-set calm in their lined faces. He realized then that his struggle wasn't unique. It was simply human, a shared condition among those who had given their lives to seek holiness. He remembered in particular seeing Brother Gautier once, sitting alone in the corner of the refectory with his head bowed and one hand pressed over his chest. In that quiet posture, not dramatic, not theatrical, just tired and humble, Theodore suddenly understood: that man is fighting too. That recognition washed some of the loneliness out of his own shame. Meanwhile, Father Silvestre kept guiding him with practiced discernment. He taught him that so-called sinful thoughts didn't all come from the same place, and that the right response depended on their source. Some came from the flesh, and fasting helped there. Some came from the world, and withdrawal, silence, enclosure helped there. Some, he said, came from the enemy, and those required prayer and the sign of the cross, the physical gesture of spiritual authority. That threefold way of thinking, so common in medieval spirituality, gave Theodore a battle map. It turned a fog of confusion into a simple step-by-step defense. He was also learning that touch was the most direct way to anchor his mind. The roughness of the cilice against his skin, used carefully, in moderation, as a reminder and not as a spectacle. The cold hardness of the stone beneath his knees, the slight drag of quill on parchment beneath his fingers in the scriptorium. All of these sensations pulled him back into the present moment. They interrupted fantasy. This was, in practice, how gentle mortification worked. It didn't exist just to cause pain. It existed to break the hold of unreality. There's an authentic detail about 11th century monastic life that he began to appreciate. Many abbeys had some form of drainage, latrine channels, even basic washing areas. Bathing wasn't as frequent as it had been in the ancient world, but washing still carried spiritual meaning for some monks. Theodore started to associate the cool feel of clean water on his skin and the faint scent of freshness afterward with interior renewal. A simple act of washing, face, hands, back of the neck, became for him a quiet meditation on inner cleanliness, not just physical hygiene. This sensory approach to discipline didn't erase the problem, but it took away some of its despair, and that mattered. He could feel a quiet warmth of hope in his chest now, not the frantic relief of, "I've beaten it," but the gentler comfort of, "I am being taught how to endure it." He began to understand confession not only as forgiveness, but as a kind of draining. You empty the poison before it spreads. You name the thought before it hardens into guilt. You let it out in the presence of someone who will not condemn you. That rhythm, speak, release, breathe, kept him from sinking into hopelessness. He practiced seeing with simplicity. He deliberately trained his gaze on ordinary things in the abbey without attaching desire or judgment to them. The soft tone of old wood, the uneven mortar between stones, the pale, honest daylight slipping in through unglazed windows. He let those details become small studies in divine order and created beauty. This quiet, visual contemplation became an antidote to the complexity and seduction of imagined scenes. Reality, seen clearly and gently, was calmer than fantasy. At night, the vigil hours slowly stopped feeling like punishment. They began to feel like a privilege, a private audience with God. The chapel at that hour was cold and dark, and that chill had its own language. It said, "This is serious, this is sacred." He would sit or kneel in that darkness and listen to the soft pattern of his own breathing. He tried to match his inner rhythm to the outer stillness. When the two aligned, his breath and the silence, he felt an unforced serenity settle over him. He also discovered that the monastery's day, with its smooth transitions from one duty to the next, chant to labor, labor to study, study to personal prayer, was protecting him. The structure itself was medicine. It left very little empty space where his mind could wander and build temptations from boredom. As Father Silvestre had warned him, idleness and overindulgence were the roots that often fed both lust and acedia, that heavy spiritual weariness. Constant, purposeful occupation starved those roots. Theodore began using inner speech as a weapon. When intrusive thoughts appeared, he didn't just panic inwardly, he answered them, in Latin, sometimes in short, sharp phrases from the Psalms, sometimes in brief lines from Saint Benedict. He spoke to the temptation instead of silently submitting to it. That internal dialogue, almost like a command spoken aloud inside his own head, broke the spell of the image and replaced it with doctrine, order, clarity. In that sense, the word itself became his shield and his blade. He started to realize that the point of his struggle wasn't only his personal salvation. It was also forming him into someone who could understand other people's weakness. Someone who one day might carry another frightened brother through the same darkness. That thought humbled him. Compassion, he realized, was growing in him as a direct result of his penance. Suffering had softened his judgment. Pain had made him gentler. The final step toward serenity, at least in this first stage of his journey, was accepting something that at first had terrified him. Temptation would never fully disappear. It would visit him in one form or another for the rest of his life, but it didn't have to rule him. He didn't have to obey it. That acceptance felt strangely like release instead of defeat. It freed him from the impossible pressure of perfection and placed him under the mercy of God, where honest effort mattered more than flawless success. He closed his eyes and felt the cool night air slipping in through the small opening in his cell. A quiet sense of belonging settled over him. He could feel, almost physically, that he had crossed the first hard threshold of discipline. He hadn't become perfect. He had become teachable. And that, finally, brought him peace. The third stage of Theodore's discipline was the deep detailing of inner observation, a kind of methodical introspection that went beyond merely fighting sinful thoughts and sought to understand their most subtle roots. It demanded a calm honesty he was only beginning to master. He began keeping notes on a small wax tablet, marking the exact moments of the day when temptation struck hardest, noting his physical condition and emotional state beforehand. In doing so, he turned his own being into an object of clinical spiritual study, a careful experiment in self-knowledge. He discovered that temptation often crept in after the more substantial meals, still austere by any worldly standard, when the body's warmth rose and the mind relaxed in digestion. That realization confirmed the wisdom behind fasting and moderation, as Father Silvestre had prescribed. The sweet, heady scent of fruit sometimes served as a treat, or the dense taste of sacramental wine, which he avoided when possible, became sensory triggers he now guarded against like a watchman at a gate. He understood that the pleasures of taste and the pleasures of flesh were deeply intertwined. The slow, descriptive rhythm of this new practice taught him to appreciate the texture of time itself inside the abbey, where hours were not counted by clock, but by the movement of light and the tolling of bells. That absence of haste was essential for deep discipline. He could feel the cold morning air entering his cell and the soft warmth of his own breath, the alternating sensations of temperature creating a neutral backdrop, allowing the finer movements of his soul to appear, as if illuminated for study. The human story that deepened his discipline came from a tale Father Silvestre once told about Saint Jerome, the famed translator of Scripture, who even in the solitude of the desert was tormented by visions of Roman feasts and dances. To fight them, Jerome struck his chest with a stone and wept bitterly. For Theodore, this was not a literal invitation to imitate, but a comfort, proof that even the greatest saints suffered, and that humility in admitting one's battle was the true path forward. His meditative practice on the coldness of stone, a constant presence throughout the abbey, became a kind of physical and spiritual anchor. The stone's solidity represented faith's permanence in contrast to the fleeting illusions of desire. He often stood still in the cloister, fingertips pressed against the massive wall, feeling its rough surface and steady chill. That tactile stillness became a meditation on eternity itself, a quieting of the spirit agitated by temporary longing. He read more about the hermit monks of early medieval times, who withdrew into caves and mountains to wage this same spiritual war alone. He realized that communal life in the abbey was, in truth, a merciful moderation of that severity, a structure designed to keep solitude from turning into despair or madness. It was a small but meaningful historical truth that filled him with gratitude for the Church's wisdom. One curious detail of medieval monastic discipline was the role of the bell, not just as a measure of time, but as a theological weapon. Its resonant vibration, it was believed, drove away demons and the forces of evil. Theodore began to use each toll as a signal, an external command, to cast out any impure thought present at that instant. The deep, vibrating sound became a ritual of purification, a sonic gesture of focus and renewal. The most powerful human story he could summon against temptation was the memory of his own vow, the day he entered the order, the moment he promised chastity and obedience. He held fast to that memory like a shield, recalling the scent of holy oil and the heavy weight of his habit on that sacred day. That sensory and emotional connection to the foundation of his faith gave him strength and a sense of direction whenever his resolve faltered. Father Silvestre had also taught him the Jesus prayer, the rhythmic repetition of, "Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner." 8. The act of breathing in rhythm with the whispered phrase became a cleansing cycle of sound and motion. The focus required to articulate the words, both mental and physical, filled his mind completely, dissolving temptation before it could form. It was a meditative technique that bound together body, sound, and spirit. In the scriptorium, the faint glow of oil lamps and beeswax candles cast soft light across the parchment. The warm, sweet smell of wax mingled with the steady breath of the flames. To Theodore, that light became a symbol of knowledge and sanctity, the visible sign of reason and faith, pushing back the inner darkness of ignorance and temptation. He came to understand that true humility was not the denial of weakness, but the willingness to accept it, to know that even after all his effort, he would still be vulnerable. Peace, he realized, did not come from erasing fragility, but from trusting divine mercy to meet him within it. That calm awareness, the acceptance of human incompleteness and divine perfection, became the key to freeing himself from guilt and sustaining perseverance with a lighter, joyful heart, the complete opposite of the despair that had once weighed him down. The deepening of Theodore's discipline led him to notice the temperature of his cell, how the biting cold of dawn and the heavy warmth of midday affected his focus. He began associating excessive heat with restlessness of the flesh, and severe cold with the danger of acedia, spiritual lethargy. It reinforced the need for moderation in everything: climate, diet, emotion. He drank well water slowly, using its cool freshness as a sensory tool to clear his mind, a tactile counterpoint that interrupted obsessive thought and brought him back to the simplicity of the present moment. The most comforting story came not from a saint's life, but from Father Silvestre himself, who one evening, in a rare moment of intimacy, confessed that he too had struggled with similar temptations in his youth. What saved him, he said, was learning to transform the energy of battle into active charity, serving the poor in the nearby village. That example of channeling desire into service inspired Theodore to spend his scarce free hours helping the infirmarian. The scent of herbs and balms, the rough weave of linen bandages under his fingers, those tangible signs of real suffering grounded him, pulling him away from the illusory suffering of his imagination. A historical insight that supported his discipline came from medieval dietary customs. Certain foods were considered hot and stimulating, meat and spices which monks avoided, while others, like vegetables and fish, were seen as cool and calming. Theodore began choosing his meals consciously, favoring cool foods to keep both body and mind temperate. It was an act of practical self-control rooted in humoral medicine, the science of balance that had guided monastic health for centuries. The sound of wind whistling through the abbey's stone cracks, that low, constant murmur, became for him a poetic symbol of divine whisper or temptation's subtle voice. He trained his hearing to discern within that sound what carried peace and what stirred disturbance. Nature itself became a classroom of discernment, teaching him the difference between serenity and agitation through attentive listening. He began using the Jesus prayer not only as mental redirection, but as a breathing rhythm, syncing the words with each inhale and exhale. "Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner." Breath became prayer, and prayer became breath, a natural, organic form of meditation that anchored his mind in his body and kept it from scattering into daydream. His readings from the Desert Fathers deepened this reflection on impermanence. He meditated on the transience of all sensory pleasure, using the image of dust and ashes, memento mori, as a philosophical shield. It reminded him that everything fades: flesh, sweetness, beauty, pain. Only divine love endures. The thought stripped temptation of its glamour and replaced it with quiet clarity. Touching sacred things became part of his sensory discipline. Each time he entered or left the chapel, he dipped his fingers into holy water, feeling its cool moisture against his forehead, sometimes tinged faintly with salt. The act had smell, texture, and temperature, all reinforcing the distinction between the sacred and the profane. That small ritual created mental boundaries strong enough to guard his imagination from worldly intrusion. Theodore learned, slowly and painfully, that excessive severity, harsh self-judgment, relentless scrutiny, was itself a hidden temptation, the pride of wanting to be flawless. The real victory, he came to see, lay in gentleness, in trusting mercy more than punishment. He would often recall Father Silvestra's calm smile, that quiet expression of achieved peace. It was proof that the goal of the path wasn't despair through discipline, but peace through balance. He found comfort in simply noticing the grey-blue of slow-moving clouds above the monastery roof, the silvery softness of olive leaves in the garden, the faint ringing of a distant parish bell. Paying attention without desire or analysis, just seeing, hearing, and being, became his strongest antidote to the seductive unreality of imagination. Reality, in its simplicity, was enough. A humble story from the village moved him deeply, a peasant who came to the abbey for bread and prayer, accepting poverty and hardship with steady faith. That man's quiet dignity showed Theodore that holiness wasn't an intellectual triumph. It was the simplicity of a heart that could still love and trust. That lesson went deeper than any theological argument. It was lived truth. Each night, Theodore ended his day with a gentle farewell to his thoughts, a soft prayer of gratitude for the battle fought and the grace received. Lying down on his straw bed, feeling the coarse fabric against his skin, he let the deep silence of the abbey close around him like a cloak. In that silence he felt safe, whole, and at peace. It was clear now. His discipline was no longer just effort. It had become harmony. The rhythm of life at Saint Grégoire Abbey was about to shift, a subtle change in setting and perspective that for Theodore would serve as the next test of his newly acquired discipline. The peace of seclusion would now meet the noise and movement of the outside world. Father Silvestre gave him a simple but meaningful task: to accompany a supply cart from the abbey to the nearby village of Vernou, where they would trade part of the harvest for parchment and finer inks for the scriptorium. It was a small journey, yet one rich in sensory and emotional impact, an exercise in remaining centered beyond the monastery walls. As Theodore prepared for the trip, a trace of anxiety mixed with quiet excitement. It was a tension between serenity and unease, the feeling of leaving a sanctuary where every stone and echo was familiar. He put on a rougher, travel-worn habit, its coarse fabric brushing against his skin like a physical reminder of who he was. A monk, even on the road, carrying his vows and discipline into the secular world. That, he told himself, was the true heart of his vocation. Passing through the great oak gates, he was immediately enveloped in a cascade of sounds, long muffled by the monastery's thick walls. The shrill song of forest birds, the creak of cartwheels under load, the steady thud of hooves on packed earth. It was a noisy symphony, a striking contrast to the cloister's quiet. The dusty road carried a heavy, earthy scent mixed with the pungence of fresh manure and the sweet trace of wildflowers along the ditch. His senses, long trained to silence, now faced their own trial by immersion. On the road, he found a kind of parable in the man guiding the convoy. Etienne, an elderly carter with a sun-creased face and an easy smile. When Theodore asked how he managed such calm amid the chaos of the world, Etienne shrugged and said, "Peace is in the rhythm of work and in tending what's alive." That answer, simple yet luminous, stayed with him. Contemplation through action, serenity born from steady hands. The road wound through soft green hills. Theodore felt the warm sunlight on his face, then the cool wind tugging at his sleeve, a rhythm of heat and chill that reminded him of creation's imperfect beauty. He turned the steady pace of walking into a prayer, syncing each step and heartbeat to the Jesus prayer whispered under his breath. The motion itself became a form of devotion, a moving meditation that steadied his mind. As Vernou came into view, another curiosity caught his eye, a stone bridge spanning the river, broad and solid, one of many such crossings built by monastic orders to aid merchants and pilgrims. To Theodore, it looked like a metaphor carved in stone, the bridge between spirit and world, cloister and village, and at that moment he realized he was that bridge himself, a living connection between the two realms. The thought filled him with purpose and quiet pride. The village unfolded gradually, timber and mud houses clustered close, thatched roofs trailing wisps of smoke. The air carried the mingled scents of wood fire, baked bread, and life itself. Warmer, messier, and more tempting than the purified air of the abbey. Voices called out, dogs barked, carts rattled. The sensory noise of humanity struck him like a wave. It wasn't unpleasant, just overwhelming. He reminded himself, listen, but don't cling. See, but don't stare. A moment of tenderness pierced him unexpectedly. A young mother passed by, smiling, a child on her hip. Something in that simple human warmth stirred him deeply. He recognized it instantly, that fragile thread between compassion and longing. And, remembering Father Silvestra's teachings, he turned it into a silent prayer for them both. It was emotional alchemy, transmuting desire into charity. Touch became his refuge. He held his wooden rosary in one hand, feeling the cool smoothness of each bead slide between his fingers. Its texture was a reminder of his vows, an anchor in the swirl of stimuli. The faint tapping of beads against one another blended with the rhythm of his steps, a quiet, continuous murmur of prayer surrounding his thoughts like a soft shield. Entering the heart of Vernou, the air grew thick with warmth, the mingled heat of people and animals. Scents collided, sweat, sour wine, spice, leather, smoke. It was a flood of sensation, neither pleasant nor repellent, simply alive. Theodore walked through it with measured calm, accepting it as part of the world's wholeness, neither shunning nor surrendering to it. It was, he realized, the perfect test of his discipline, to remain still within motion, to carry silence inside the noise. As Theodore stepped into the central square of Vernou, the marketplace pulsed with human life, a vibrant kaleidoscope of color, motion, and sound. Merchants in bright fabrics shouted over one another, animals shifted and brayed, and the gleam of polished tools caught the morning sun. It was a swirl of visual abundance that sharply contrasted with the abbey's muted palette of browns and greys. He had to consciously engage his inner filter, teaching his eyes to see only shapes and tones, not allure, not distraction. It was an exercise in visual detachment, requiring every ounce of will and the discipline he had spent months cultivating. The air was thick with scent, sharp spices from the east, the pungent tang of tanned leather, the heady sweetness of new wine. For Theodore, it was an assault of temptations through the nose. So he turned again to the Jesus prayer, repeating it silently, rhythmically, each phrase a breath against memory and imagination. The prayer became his antidote, transforming each smell into an invitation to purification, every inhalation into a whispered act of surrender. He found himself studying the structure of the market with the quiet curiosity of both monk and historian. Its simple, functional design reflected the order of medieval life. Many such markets were overseen by the church or by the local lord to ensure fair measures and honest trade. That thought pleased him. Even commerce at its best could mirror divine order. In every exchange, every weight and measure, he tried to glimpse a trace of the justice and harmony that God had set into creation. Etienne, the carter, guided him to the tent of a lay scribe where they were to purchase parchment. The scent that met him there, of fresh vellum, warm beeswax, and powdered cinnabar and gold used in illuminated manuscripts, felt like home. It was the smell of knowledge and holiness. When Theodore ran his fingers lightly over a piece of fine calfskin, its smooth texture and faint warmth stirred a familiar calm. The simple act of touch reconnected him to the beauty of his vocation, copying, illuminating, preserving the word. While waiting for the order to be tallied, he noticed a small drama unfolding nearby, a lost child crying in the crowd. The sound pierced the market's noise like a single pure note. Compassion rose instantly in him, sharp and tender, but he didn't let it turn to sorrow or anxiety. Instead, he transformed that energy into silent intercession, whispering a prayer for peace until the child was safely found. It was a living exercise in discernment, feeling without attachment, loving without possession. The heat in the square was heavy now, sun reflecting off canvas stalls, bodies pressed close. Sweat dampened his wool habit. A tactile discomfort he accepted as a small mortification, a reminder that all sensations are temporary. The body complains, he thought, and the spirit learns patience. He remembered Father Silvestra's counsel. Temptation should not be fought by force alone, but by substitution. So when coarse laughter spilled from a nearby tavern, Theodore quietly replaced it in his mind with the resonant melody of psalms sung in the abbey choir. It became an act of auditory transmutation, turning discord into prayer, chaos into praise. The coins he handled, small pieces of silver and copper, felt foreign and impure in his palm. Their coldness, their faint smell of sweat and grime, spoke of a world bound by need and greed. After each exchange, he washed his hands discreetly at a public fountain. The act wasn't about hygiene, but about renewal, a tactile cleansing of the spirit, a reaffirmation of detachment from material stain, the ebb and flow of the crowd around him, the motion of people talking, trading, laughing, seemed almost musical, a living symbol of the world's restless order. For a moment, he simply watched, recognizing that this swirling life, though beautiful, could never grant him the peace of the cloister. That understanding filled him not with pride, but with gratitude for the quiet refuge waiting beyond those hills. When the final parchment was wrapped and paid for, Etienne called to him from the cart. The mission was done. Theodore felt a lightness in his chest, not triumph, but relief, the quiet joy of endurance. A cool breeze moved through the square, carrying away the heat, brushing his face like a benediction. It felt like grace. Turning toward the road that led back to Saint-Grégoire, he felt the familiar rhythm of belonging return. The abbey's silhouette rose faintly in the distance, steady, silent, immutable, and in that moment he understood what Father Silvestre had meant all along. The strength of a monk was not in fleeing temptation, but in walking through it with humility and prayer. The world had tested him, and instead of breaking, he had learned to breathe within it. The lesson ended not with victory, but with peace. Back within the quiet walls of Saint-Grégoire, Théodore turned his focus inward once more. this time through a single humble object of daily use, a small oak cup he used to drink water during long hours of fasting and labor in the scriptorium. It was a simple vessel, yet one heavy with tactile meaning and spiritual memory. After Vespers, he sat alone in his cell, the gentle chill of evening seeping through the stone, and fixed his attention entirely on the cup in his hands, a meditation through stillness and touch. The cup was dark wood, worn smooth by years of use and water. Holding it firmly between his palms had become a gesture of restraint, a physical reminder of renunciation and simplicity. Its slightly rough texture and uneven grain spoke of imperfection, a poetic contrast to the elaborate illusions his mind still sometimes produced. The vessel, in its quiet plainness, became an anchor for peace, a tangible focus that grounded his spirit in the present. When he lifted the cup to his lips, tasting the cold, clear water drawn from the abbey well, the act itself became a ritual of purification. The neutral taste and cool sensation were a counterpoint to the imagined pleasures of spiced wine or sweet fruit. Drinking became prayer, a moment of humility and gratitude for the essentials of life. It was a discipline of moderation, of giving thanks for enough. The cup carried its own quiet history. It had been carved in Father Silvestra's youth, a token of moderation, a daily reminder that holiness was found in restraint. Over decades, it had passed through the hands of countless brothers, absorbing a silence of devotion into its grain. When Theodore held it, he felt, almost physically, the continuity of faith, a lineage of calm transmitted through touch, as if serenity itself could inhabit matter. He let his gaze travel slowly across its surface, the dark veins of the oak, the tiny scratches of use, the faint water stains that time had left behind. Each flaw was a metaphor for the soul itself, worn, tested, slowly polished through discipline and grace. The cup was a mute mirror reflecting his own journey, beauty not in perfection, but in endurance and humility. A historical truth came to mind as he studied it. Medieval abbeys, built on self-sufficiency, often required monks to craft their own tools and vessels. That necessity turned labor into meditation. Every handmade object, like this wooden cup, became an extension of prayer, shaped by patience and devotion. Ora et labora was no mere motto. It lived in the grain of the wood itself. He traced the rim lightly with one finger, feeling its coolness, noticing the faint earthy scent it had absorbed from garden soil and damp air. The simplicity of that sensory world, the smell of wood, the roughness beneath his thumb, was the perfect antidote to the crowded sensations of the village market. Peace, he realized, was the art of being satisfied with little and finding meaning in what endures. Father Silvestre had once told him that desire is born of idle looking. By fixing his gaze on something plain and useful, Theodore was training his mind towards serene contemplation, turning attention from illusion to purpose, from imagining to being. The discipline of seeing was the discipline of living. He remembered, too, the gilded chalice he had glimpsed in a church at Vernou, its gleam of silver and gold against the modest darkness of his own cup. The contrast was striking. That brilliance was not for him. His vow of poverty had freed him from the weight of ownership, teaching him that true wealth was peace of soul and purity of heart. When the meditation ended, Theodore felt a calm, grounded stillness settle over him. The weight of the cup in his hands was steady and real, like the abbey itself, unchanging in its purpose. The simplicity of duty, the constancy of prayer, these were his true treasures. He placed the cup gently beside his bed and closed his eyes, resting in the quiet assurance that holiness often hides in the smallest, most ordinary things. The repeated use of Theodore's small wooden cup began to deepen his sensory connection to the idea of ascetic simplicity. The rough texture and plain form of the vessel became a constant reminder of the purity of intention he sought, a daily counterpoint to the seductive complexity of the outer world. It trained his sense of touch toward contentment and renunciation. Even the chill of the water he drank was a gentle awakening, a physical jolt that stirred him from spiritual drowsiness and drew him back to the present, a kind of inner solace, a miniature discipline woven into the fabric of his day. When he studied the tiny imperfections and knots in the grain, he found quiet beauty in their irregularity. Those natural flaws mirrored the imperfection of human nature, scarred, uneven, yet still capable of being shaped by grace. In accepting the wood's roughness, he was learning to accept his own fallibility. It was humility, not the pursuit of impossible perfection, that was healing the old wound of pride at the root of his struggle. Father Silvestre had once told him that the simplest, most ordinary objects of monastic life were silent sacramentals, tools of sanctification in disguise. Theodore began to see his wooden cup as more than a vessel for water. It was a tactile symbol of his spiritual thirst, a humble metaphor for his hunger for God. Drinking became a contemplative rite, each sip an act of devotion, a daily reminder that every necessity could become prayer if approached with awareness and gratitude. A small historical detail came to mind as he washed the cup. In medieval abbeys, wooden utensils were cleaned with ashes and hot water. The faint scent of ash and rustic soap that sometimes lingered on the rim had come to represent purification itself, the mingling of manual labor and spiritual cleansing. That humble aroma tied his physical work to his inner one, the washing of wood and soul alike. The light weight of the cup in his hands served as a gentle contrast to the heaviness of guilt he once carried. That tactile lightness was a physical reminder of the freedom confession and discipline had brought him, the joy that lay not in possession, but in release. It was the quiet happiness of a soul pared down to what was essential. A small memory surfaced, an old scribe who, upon his death, had left all his belongings, a horn inkwell, a goose quill, a small wooden crucifix, to the community. Theodore remembered how the brothers had spoken of those items with reverence, not because they were valuable, but because they had been used in faith. It struck him then that holiness clung to things through touch, through repetition, through love. His cup, too, was slowly gathering that invisible patina of devotion, becoming a vessel of memory and virtue that he would one day pass on. He admired the concave shape of the cup, how naturally it fit his hand. That quiet harmony between object and body was a metaphor for the balance he longed for, the unity between his will and God's. Even the design of the cup seemed to echo the Benedictine ideal: order, proportion, simplicity, peace carved into form. The silence surrounding him as he meditated was not empty, but full. A living silence, rich with listening. In it, he learned to distinguish the soft rhythm of his breath and the quiet beat of his heart from the whisper of temptation or the echo of self-reproach. Silence itself became both battlefield and balm, a purifying element that refined his awareness. When his meditation ended, Theodore placed the cup gently in the corner of his cell, his movements slow and deliberate. A warmth filled him, not of pride, but of belonging. He felt joined to a long, unbroken lineage of monks who had sought purity through the same humble attentiveness. Peace, he realized, was not a revelation or an ecstasy, but the slow fruit of steady perseverance, the grace found in caring deeply for the simplest details of a faithful life. Theodore's quiet focus on a single object and gesture began to expand outward, shifting from the personal to the collective. He started to see his inner struggle and discipline not as a private burden, but as an integral part of the spiritual health of the entire Abbey of Saint-Grégoire. Every monk's purity of mind, he realized, contributed to the well-being of the community, a shared current of prayer and restraint that formed an invisible wall of protection around them all. That realization brought him a deeper sense of responsibility, a new awareness that holiness was never solitary. With this broader gaze, he began to understand the discipline of silence, once felt as an obstacle, as a social instrument of purity. In the Benedictine way, silence guarded thought. It closed the door to idle talk and gossip, those subtle leaks through which distraction and temptation slipped in. The abbey's soundscape, the low murmur of the choir, the soft creak of the scriptorium door, was perfectly tuned for interior vigilance and focused meditation, a symphony of restraint. The bridge between individual and collective life was most evident in the refectory. During meals, the rule of silence was filled with the solemn voice of a brother reading aloud from sacred texts, a practice that kept minds from wandering while bodies were fed. Theodore would notice the simple smell of stew, the warmth of steam rising from the bowl, yet his hearing was fixed on the rhythmic, steady cadence of the reader's voice. Eating became a triple act of nourishment, of body, mind, and soul, a lesson in attentiveness, a quiet exercise in discipline through sound. A small human story embodied this truth. Brother Gontran, an elderly and stern monk once famed for extreme asceticism, had been gently corrected in his youth by an abbot who told him that salvation was not an individual conquest, but a shared destiny. "Your penance means little if your brothers faint beside you," the abbot had said. Gontran had since devoted himself to the herb garden, where he worked in silence among sage and thyme, his hands perfumed by healing leaves. Theodore now saw his labor not as retreat, but as love in action, the scent of herbs, the feel of their coarse stems, a sensory language of compassion and service. He came to see that his battle against temptation was not his alone. Each monk's discipline was a contribution to the collective sanctity of Saint-Grégoire. His vigilance strengthened others, just as another's prayer might shield him unseen. Father Silvestra's words echoed often in his mind. "The sin of one weakens all, and the virtue of one fortifies all." It was a profoundly medieval vision of moral interdependence, a community bound not by blood, but by grace. The rough wool of his habit, once only a personal reminder of austerity, now felt like a shared garment. Its coarse touch against his skin symbolized the vows that united them, the mutual struggle that defined their purpose. Each thread was a bond of fidelity, a physical texture of belonging that anchored him to his brothers in their common defense against the restless forces that threatened peace. In the morning choir, when the sun filtered through the rose window and spilled over the stone floor in patches of gold and red, Theodore saw a metaphor for the order and beauty that emerged from unity. Each monk's discipline was like a beam of color, separate yet part of a single harmony. The architecture of devotion mirrored the architecture of community, each stone, each voice necessary. He reflected, too, on a broader truth he had once read, that medieval abbeys were often called cities of prayer, believed to sustain the surrounding world through their constancy. Their labor, whether in farming or in copying texts, was not merely productive but intercessory, a quiet offering of stability to a turbulent age. His solitude, then, was not isolation, it was service. At day's end in the scriptorium, Theodore inhaled the scent of vellum and gall ink, a mixture of earth, tannin, and thyme. That aroma had come to mean more than knowledge. It was the fragrance of continuity, of unseen labor for the church and the world beyond the walls. The faint scratching of his quill against parchment was no longer just work. It was a rhythm of order, pushing back against the chaos of idleness, a song of quiet usefulness that linked him, line by line, to every soul the abbey prayed to sustain. The collective element in the battle against intrusive thoughts revealed itself most clearly through intercessory prayer. Theodore began turning his moments of temptation into prayers for his brothers, especially for those who seemed withdrawn or burdened by shadows. In doing so, he discovered a quiet paradox. By praying for others, he was also strengthening himself. His attention shifted from self-condemnation to compassionate service, and the warmth of charity proved to be a far more effective remedy than the chill of self-reproach. It was, he realized, a small human story of altruism, the very heart of monastic life. He came to see the shared rhythm of the abbey as a living organism, every brother contributing to its pulse and harmony. The porter who ran his hands over the rough grain of the oak gate, the sacristan who breathed in the sweetness of beeswax and oil, the librarian who felt the cool smoothness of parchment, all were threads in the fabric of communal devotion. Their coordinated motion, each act both physical and sacred, mirrored the internal order Theodore was cultivating within himself. It was a serene meditation on the virtue of cohesion. He also reflected on a social reality of the age. To many medieval peasants, an abbey was more than a spiritual center. It was a refuge, a place of stability and practical aid. The moral integrity of its monks was believed to safeguard the divine favor over the entire surrounding region. The holiness of the few protected the livelihood of the many. This sense of collective responsibility gave Theodore's personal discipline a broader and weightier purpose. His silence, his restraint, his prayer, all of it mattered beyond the cloister. The wooden rosary he carried became more than a private devotional tool. It was a visible emblem of shared vows. The smooth beads, slipping rhythmically through his fingers, echoed the murmured prayers of his brothers across the abbey. That soft, overlapping sound wove through the air like a tapestry of intercession, an invisible bond of mutual strength that kept him from the temptation of isolation. Father Silvestre had once warned him that the true danger of temptation, whether sensual or profane, was not in fleeting pleasure but in separation, the quiet fracture between a monk and his community. To fall was not merely to sin, but to withdraw from the body of prayer that sustained all. That teaching became one of Theodore's strongest anchors, reminding him that every act of restraint was not self-denial alone, but service to the mystical body that bound them together. The faint scent of wood smoke drifting from the kitchen became a sensory reminder of humility. It smelled of work, of nourishment, of service to others. For Theodore, it was an olfactory prayer, a lesson that pride, the root of his earliest anguish, could only be subdued through simple, useful labor. The humblest acts of service grounded him in the concrete rhythm of duty and love. He often thought of Brother Ambroise, the infirmarian, a man in his 30s who spent his days tending wounds, enduring the smell of sickness and the sight of pain, yet never lost his composure or his gentle smile. Ambroise embodied living charity. His serenity amid suffering showed Theodore that compassion was the truest antidote to temptation. When the heart was turned toward another's pain, there was no room left for selfish reverie. At day's end, Theodore joined his brothers for Compline, the final prayer of the night. The low, unified chant rising in the dim chapel felt like the slow closing of the day's circle, sound folding into silence, solitude dissolving into brotherhood. The harmony of their voices was more than music. It was the sound of faith itself, shared and enduring. In that moment, Theodore understood that even in weakness he was upheld by collective strength. The abbey breathed as one body, and in that breath he found his rest. The midday sun stood at its zenith, its bright light filtering through the arcades of the cloister, casting perfectly shaped squares of heat and shadow across the stone floor. The sight itself was a quiet lesson in geometry and order, an invitation to pause within the measured rhythm of prayer and labor that governed life at Saint-Grégoire. During the brief stillness between Sext and his return to the scriptorium, Theodore took refuge on a cool stone bench beneath one of the arches, letting the hush and the half-light draw him inward. This was his sacred interval, a moment of recollection meant to consolidate the quiet progress of his discipline. He closed his eyes and listened. The silence around him was not the absence of sound, but the absence of disorder. From the center of the cloister came the steady murmur of the fountain, the slow dripping of water into its basin, rhythmic, even, and unhurried. That soft, ceaseless sound became a natural metronome for his mind, pacing his thoughts, keeping them from scattering. The simplicity of it steadied him. It was auditory serenity, silence given a heartbeat. The contrast between the cold stone beneath him and the warm air on his skin became its own meditation, a tactile reminder of the dual nature of spiritual life, the rigor of discipline coexisting with the warmth of grace. The rough weight of his woolen habit anchored him in the physical world, reminding him that faith began in the body, not apart from it. The moment was a small, human story of balance, the harmony between effort and rest, austerity and peace. He opened his eyes and observed his brothers in quiet motion around the cloister, their plain garments, their identical gestures, the slow, deliberate pace of their steps. There was beauty in that sameness. In renouncing individuality and the urge for distinction, temptations that ruled the secular world, they had found a collective dignity, a silent equality of purpose. To Theodore, this was sociology made visible, the peace born of shared discipline. Father Sylvestre had warned him often that boredom and idleness were the wide gates of temptation. This pause, therefore, was not emptiness, but active stillness, a filling of the silence with gratitude, reflection, and remembrance of the morning scripture. To rest the mind was not to leave it vacant, it was to occupy it with the good so that the idle could find no space to enter. The faint fragrance of jasmine and lavender drifted from the inner garden, clean and unadorned, a floral purity far removed from the heavy, enticing perfumes he had once smelled in the village of Vernou. Theodore took in the scent, as though it were a prayer itself, a gentle symbol of the virtue he sought, fragrant, quiet, and natural. It was an olfactory act of purification, an awakening of joy through simplicity. He thought briefly of time itself, how in the Middle Ages hours were marked not by clock hands, but by the sun's course and the canonical hours of prayer. The monastery's rhythm followed the sky. Watching the sun hover above the cloister, Theodore felt his inner tempo slow to match it. Time was not something to conquer, but to inhabit. In that acceptance, he found release from the anxious haste that once drove his restless thoughts. This moment of contemplation, brief though it was, had a purpose: renewal. The battle against intrusive thought was exhausting, and the mind could not wage it endlessly. Active rest was its shield, a Benedictine wisdom of moderation that prevented zeal from decaying into despair. Balance, not intensity, sustained the spirit. As the sun began to move westward, its light shifted gently across the stones, lengthening the shadows between the columns. Theodore watched the slow transformation with quiet awe. It was a visual benediction, the day passing in peace, the promise of light returning tomorrow. In that movement of sun and shade, he felt the rhythm of grace itself, patient, constant, and sure. And in its warmth, his spirit rested, calm and whole. During this quiet interlude, Theodore engaged in a slower, subtler kind of self-examination, not of grave sins, but of the small lapses in attention, the brief wanderings of thought that might have opened tiny doors to temptation. He treated his mind as a delicate instrument, requiring constant calibration. In silence, he listened inwardly with honesty, tuning his ear to the murmur of his own soul, learning to distinguish the voice of temptation, impatient and accusing, from the voice of grace, gentle and consoling. It was an exercise in spiritual listening, one Father Silvestre had patiently taught him to cultivate. He became aware of the texture of the air in the cloister, the faint shimmer of dust motes drifting through sunlight, moving almost imperceptibly. This minute observation led him to recall the medieval understanding of matter as something permeated with the sacred. Every physical thing, every natural phenomenon was a quiet reminder of God's presence. Even a particle of dust, glimmering for a heartbeat, became a symbol of creation. The cool breeze brushing his face felt like a tactile whisper of renewal, a humble breath of ascetic simplicity. A human story surfaced in his mind. The abbot of Saint-Grégoire, a man of about 60, whose worn habit and austere face concealed a deep love for nature and music. In rare moments of leisure, the abbot was often seen in the garden, leaning over a rosebush, breathing in the sweetness of its petals, while bees hummed softly nearby. That simple image, a holy man delighting quietly in beauty, reminded Theodore that sanctity was not the denial of beauty, but its redirection toward the Creator. To perceive beauty rightly was to give thanks. It was humility in the form of joy. He kept the rhythm of the Jesus prayer running silently within him, its short, measured repetition steadying his thoughts like beads on a string. The prayer became both breath and metronome, transforming stillness into a time of sowing. Each whispered invocation was an act of cultivation, planting humility, guarding focus, and allowing no idle space for wandering imagination. A gentle curiosity crossed his mind as he watched the cloister garden, a reflection on color in sacred art. In the medieval world, blue, the color of the heavens and the Virgin's mantle, symbolized purity, while green, the color of the garden and the earth, meant hope and life. Gazing at the soft blue of the sky and the deep green of the leaves, Theodore found a visual prayer taking form before him. These colors became his meditation, a serene contemplation of divine attributes, a counterbalance to the vivid, seductive hues of the secular world he had left behind. His hands brushed against the rough stone of the bench. The uneven surface was a physical reminder of his own imperfection, a silent catechism on humility. Even in peace, vigilance was needed. Temptation often crept in under the guise of calm. The stone's coarse chill grounded him, a small tactile story of penance and self-awareness that kept complacency at bay. The slow rhythm and contemplative quiet of the moment allowed his thoughts to return to Father Silvestre, to the memory of his measured voice and the kindness behind his eyes. Recalling those moments was like being gently corrected again, as though his mentor's spirit hovered close, guiding him back toward balance. That inner vision of calm wisdom was a thread of continuity, binding Theodore to the long chain of tradition and experience from which his faith drew strength. As his pause came to an end, Theodore fixed his gaze on the fountain at the center of the cloister. Its dripping sound, steady and patient, seemed to echo grace itself, falling drop by drop into the dryness of the soul, softening it, feeding what was hidden beneath. He rose slowly, feeling the sun's gentle warmth against his back, and walked toward the scriptorium. His mind felt clear again, his spirit quietly refreshed. The discipline of silence had done its work, leaving behind its finest fruit, a deep and lasting peace. Theodore's discipline had prepared him for a new stage in his inner journey, one no longer confined to the walls of his own mind, but expanded through the eyes of his mentor, Father Silvestre, and the quiet stories of other monks whose lives he now observed with renewed empathy and discernment. The scene shifted gently to the abbey's infirmary, a place where human frailty stood unadorned, and time moved at the slow, merciful rhythm of care and convalescence. Here, suffering and peace existed side by side, teaching lessons the silence of the cloister could not. Assigned to assist Brother Ambroise, the infirmarian, for several hours each day, Theodore entered an entirely different world. The air was dense with the scent of thyme and lavender, blended with the sharper smell of vinegar and damp stone, the unmistakable fragrance of illness and healing intertwined. Gone was the clean austerity of the scriptorium. In its place came the sound of slow breathing, an occasional low moan, and the soft rustle of cloth, an oral landscape of vulnerability that demanded compassion rather than contemplation. This new perspective, service, drew his attention outward, away from the labyrinth of his own temptations. The tangible suffering of others became the antidote to the imagined struggles of his mind. Charity, he realized, was tactile. The rough weave of a woolen blanket beneath his hands, the fevered warmth of a patient's forehead, the cool weight of the water he offered. Each touch was a small act of prayer made flesh, a discipline of tenderness that sanctified his senses. Brother Ambrose himself was a living lesson. His calm was unwavering, his hands moved with a craftsman's quiet assurance, blending care with skill. Watching him, Theodore understood that peace did not come from the absence of problems. The infirmary was full of them, but from the full, humble attention given to the duty of the moment. Serenity was born of service, not solitude. He learned, too, an unexpected lesson in monastic medicine, that wine, diluted with herbs, was used to cleanse wounds for its antiseptic strength, and that illness was seen not merely as physical decay, but as a disturbance of soul. Healing, therefore, required harmony between body and spirit, a belief that resonated deeply with his own journey. His fasting and penance, once sources of inner struggle, now appeared as forms of preventive medicine for the heart. The gentle rhythm of Brother Ambroise's voice as he gave quiet instructions became Theodore's new chant, his substitute for the Gregorian melodies of the choir. Every word demanded attention, every action carried weight. A wrong dosage or careless gesture could harm. The necessity of precision tethered his wandering thoughts, transforming his restlessness into presence. Service required focus, and focus was the purest form of prayer. Among the patients, he found another small human parable. One sick monk, weakened but serene, bore his pain with steady faith, his eyes clear despite his exhaustion. In that face, Theodore saw a mirror of his own inner trials. Physical suffering, he realized, could refine the soul as surely as spiritual struggle. The body's frailty could teach what intellect alone could not, that surrender, accepted with grace, was a path toward union with Christ's own passion. Even the smell of the room carried meaning. The tallow candles burning beside the beds released a heavy animal scent, a stark contrast to the clean sweetness of the beeswax candles used in the chapel. It was the scent of mortality, of flesh and impermanence. For Theodore, that odor became a reminder of human limits, a quiet counterpoint to the alluring fantasy of eternal pleasure whispered by temptation. Here, surrounded by weakness and care, he felt anchored again in reality, in the brief, sacred fragility of life, and in the urgency of learning to love well while time remained. Father Silvestra's perspective was evident in Theodore's new training within the infirmary. Patience with the frailty of others was the mirror of God's patience with one's own weakness. Service, he realized, was theology in motion, charity expressed through touch and presence rather than words. As he tended wounds and felt the clean linen sheets brush against fevered skin, he understood that he was, in truth, tending his own soul. Active compassion filled the space once occupied by self-absorption and restless introspection. This was purification through love in action. Brother Ambroise taught him to listen to the soft rasp of dried herbs being crushed in the stone mortar, a humble rhythm of meditation. The sound was steady and grounding, a rustic form of contemplation that replaced inner murmuring with useful motion. The pungent aroma of rue and St. John's wort filled the room, sharp and cleansing. Theodore learned to let that scent anchor his attention, to let his mind rest in the curative power of creation rather than drift into fantasy. Even smell, properly guided, could become a tool of devotion. He reflected on a custom of medieval monasteries. Though their medicine was simple, the care of the sick was considered the highest act of charity. The infirmary was one of the few places where the rule of silence was gently relaxed, to allow consoling words, confessions, or murmured prayers. It was a reminder that the Church valued comfort of body and soul alike, a truth that deepened Theodore's reverence for the order that had shaped his vocation. In one corner, an old monk lay in quiet labor, his thin hands knotting a plain cord over and over. It was his own small rosary, a tactile prayer born of weakness. Watching him, Theodore felt a surge of awe. Here was perseverance made visible, frailty transformed into discipline, pain turned into prayer. That simple rhythm of fingers and thread became a living parable of faith that endured even when strength was gone. When Theodore took the hand of another patient, frail, warm, and trembling, the contact stirred something within him. The warmth of that human grasp replaced the cold solitude of his stone cell. In that moment of shared fragility, he discovered a truth more healing than any austerity. Compassion itself was the surest defense against temptation. Where empathy lived, pride and despair could not. He began to see that peace did not come from suppressing his thoughts through sheer force, that only gave them power. Instead, peace arose from redirection, turning the energy of struggle towards service. By filling his hours with concrete acts of love, he left no room for inner noise. Discipline was not about denial, but transformation, the channeling of passion into purpose. From the kitchen drifted the smell of fresh bread, warm and comforting. It mingled with the sharper medicinal scents and seemed to wrap the infirmary in a reminder of life's simple gifts. For Theodore, that aroma became a quiet homily on humility. Nourishment existed not for indulgence, but for strength in service. Each whiff renewed his gratitude and his resolve to fast, not for pride, but for love. By the end of his shift, Theodore's body was tired in a way his prayers had never made it, a wholesome exhaustion that came from giving. It was a peace unlike the calm of contemplation, a peace of purpose fulfilled. As he left the infirmary, the cool night air met his warm skin, a gentle contrast that awakened him to gratitude. Each breath of the cold evening carried the satisfaction of duty done. He understood now that the battle against temptation was never an end in itself. Its purpose was to clear the mind for love, for service. The time in the infirmary had taught him that holiness was found not in isolation, but in patience, patience with others' weakness and with his own. That was the essence of contemplative wisdom, serenity woven through the fabric of daily compassion. Back in his cell, Theodore felt the rough straw beneath him and the deep stillness of the abbey surrounding him. The silence was no longer merely the absence of sound, it was the echo of harmony, the quiet fruit of labor and grace intertwined. He closed his eyes, resting in a peace that was both earned and given, the gentle stillness of a soul made whole through service. The next stage of Theodore's discipline was the amplification of the senses, a deliberate training to turn the rich sensory world of St. Gregoire Abbey into a stronger barrier against the seductive unreality of imagination. He sought to heighten his awareness of sound, scent, texture, and taste, transforming every perception into an anchor point and a silent prayer. It was a deepening of his practice of presence, a discipline of attention that transformed the ordinary into the sacred. The sound of his brother's footsteps in the cloister, once unnoticed, now became for Theodore a quiet rhythm of communion and duty, a steady, low cadence, symbolizing perseverance and order. He synchronized his inner recitation of the Jesus prayer to that sound, letting the shuffle of sandals over stone become a living metronome of devotion. The rhythm of others walking in obedience was no longer mere background noise. It was an oral pulse of faith, a subtle exercise in listening as prayer. He trained his sense of smell by focusing on the lingering incense that clung to the chapel's curtains and vestments, a dense, resinous fragrance mingling with the cool scent of stone and the faint sweetness of beeswax. This olfactory harmony was the perfume of sanctity itself, a sensory sign of separation from the world. Whenever memories of the marketplace tempted his mind with worldly odors, spiced wine, roasted meat, perfume, he would inhale the sacred mixture deeply, grounding himself again in the purity of the monastic air. Touch became a form of meditation. As he walked through the cloister, he would brush his fingers along the rough stone wall, feeling the uneven mortar and the chill of the rock. That tactile contrast, firmness beneath his hand, life moving within him, reminded him of the solidity of the real and the fleeting nature of fantasy. It was a small human ritual of grounding, the body teaching the soul to stay present. He also adopted a medieval gesture of reverence he had seen others practice, kissing the hand of Father Silvestre or of elder brothers. The brief warmth of that human touch replaced the cold isolation of his earlier discipline. That exchange, humility received and returned, became an emotional antidote to solitude. Through contact, he remembered belonging. Through belonging, he remembered love. At night, he carried a small oil lamp through the dim corridors, its gentle sway casting slow waves of light and shadow on the walls. The motion of flame and darkness became hypnotic, a visual rhythm that steadied his vision and prevented his mind from drifting into the murky inventions of imagination. The simple act of walking with light became a moving meditation, a practice of awareness within the stillness of night. Even taste was drawn into his discipline. The cool purity of water, once merely refreshing, now carried meaning. Its clarity and simplicity became symbols of chastity and restraint. He drank slowly, savoring its clean, neutral flavor as a counterpoint to the imagined richness of wine or spiced food. The act of tasting the plain became an act of temperance, a silent vow renewed at the level of the senses. Father Silvestre explained that this practice was part of the monastic art of filling the soul with reality, crushing vice with virtue. By crowding the imagination with the true, with the tangible beauty of God's creation, there was no room left for illusion. The senses, properly disciplined, became not gateways of temptation, but instruments of grace. It was, in essence, the theology of the body made practical, an asceticism of fullness rather than denial. Even the faint friction of his woolen habit against his skin became part of this harmony, a soft, constant whisper of vow and presence. With each step and task, the sound reminded him of his calling. It was the music of perseverance, humble, rhythmic, and ever-present, wrapping him like a living prayer as he moved through the slow, luminous order of the Abbey day. The cool smoothness of the glass Theodore used to cover the illuminated pages in the scriptorium became a tactile lesson in both fragility and protection. It reminded him that his inner purity was as delicate as the artwork beneath his hands, a surface easily marred if not guarded with care. Each touch turned into a small, human parable of vigilance and humility, a gesture of reverence toward the beauty of God's word. He deepened his auditory awareness by isolating the sound of his own voice during the canonical hours, listening to his Latin pronunciation with patient focus. He tried to blend it perfectly with the unison chant of his brothers, letting their collective tone shape his own. This pursuit of sonic harmony became an image of inner harmony, all his faculties striving to sing in tune with the will of God. Such listening kept him from drifting into distraction or vanity. He recalled an intriguing medieval custom. In some monasteries, monks practiced silent reading aloud in the scriptorium, a faint, rhythmic murmuring that filled the air. This gentle hum prevented the dangerous stillness of total silence, which could invite idle thoughts. For Theodore, that collective murmur became an auditory shield, a mass of prayerful sound that drowned out the solitary whisper of temptation. The scent of burning wood from the abbey's autumn furnaces spread through the halls, a warm, smoky fragrance of work and sustenance. Theodore used this earthy aroma as a reminder of gratitude and duty. The heat that kept them alive was born of labor. Every inhalation grounded him in the physical reality of the cloister, anchoring his mind in service rather than abstraction. His eyes, too, became instruments of prayer. He trained his sight on the rich pigments and intricate details of the illuminated manuscripts, the bright red of minium, the shimmering gold leaf, the precise geometry of borders and letters. Each stroke of color was an antidote to the inner chaos of imagination, a glimpse of divine order rendered by human hands. To contemplate beauty in discipline was, for him, to see God's perfection mirrored in miniature. The quill itself, light in his fingers, its sharp nib whispering over parchment, became his companion in devotion. The rhythm of its movement was like a steady breath of prayer, each line of script a quiet act of offering. The slight resistance of the parchment beneath the quill tethered him to purpose. The motion, repetitive yet meaningful, kept idleness at bay. He often recalled the story of the hermit of the marsh, a tale he had once copied from an old scroll. The hermit, tormented by temptation, fought back by planting reeds and weaving them into baskets day after day, turning his labor into a weapon of grace. That story became Theodore's guide, a reminder that holiness wasn't found in sudden triumphs, but in steady, faithful repetition. At the end of each day, Theodore took a moment of stillness in the garden. He would stand barefoot on the cool grass, breathing in the scent of damp earth and evening dew. The simplicity of nature, the touch of the ground, the whisper of air, the fading light, gathered him back into peace. It was the closing act of his discipline, a gentle harmony between body and spirit before the silence of night. When he finally lay down to rest, sleep came quietly, the kind that follows a day well lived and a soul at ease within grace. The atmosphere at Saint Grégoire Abbey began to shift gradually, and this slow change in light, climate, and the community's emotional temperature became a new test of Theodore's inner stability. The sky, once a deep blue, turned to a soft, opaque grey that heralded autumn's approach. The light filtering through the chapel's plain-stained glass grew diffuse and melancholy, inviting deeper introspection and a more resilient serenity. Without the comfort of sunlight, Theodore had to sustain his peace from within. The emotional temperature of the abbey shifted as well. Field labor waned, and the monks turned inward toward study, reading, and contemplation. The growing silence and solitude stretched each day thinner and longer. In the scriptorium, Theodore felt the chill creep into his hands. If left unchecked, that cold could slip into melancholy, the shadow of acedia, the spiritual lethargy that opened the door to wandering thoughts. To counter it, he cupped his breath over his fingers, letting his own warmth serve as a small act of self-command, a ritual of presence that kept him anchored. He reinforced his discipline through gentle repetition, inwardly echoing Father Silvestra's teaching. Temptation is inevitable, but consent is a choice. He repeated it rhythmically, aligning the phrase with the soft drone of wind against the abbey walls. The sound became a low chant of perseverance, nature's own voice reminding him that endurance was a form of faith. The wind carried with it the smell of damp wood and decomposing leaves from the forest, an aroma of endings and slow renewal. Theodore received it as an olfactory memento mori, a reminder of life's transience. The scent of decay was not repulsive, but purifying. It pulled his mind from the lure of fleeting pleasures and rooted him in the eternal, the only realm where desire could rest without corruption. He remembered a small human story from his years with Father Silvestra. When the cold set in, the elder monk would double his recitation of the Jesus Prayer, turning the season itself into spiritual resistance. The chill, he had once said, is a teacher of vigilance. Imitating that wisdom, Theodore extended his night vigils, letting the cold of the chapel bite gently at his skin, a chosen discomfort that kept him awake, alert, and grateful. The soundscape, too, had changed. The sharp cries of summer birds gave way to the deeper tones of owls and the long whisper of the wind. Theodore trained his ear to find peace in this lower register, to hear grace in monotony. Each muted sound became a note in the hidden symphony of prayer, teaching him that serenity was not silence, but the quiet comprehension of God's breath in the world. He watched the texture of low clouds and the silvery light that seeped through them. Their muted color spoke to him of humility, a faith unadorned by visions or miracles. It was a visual antidote to spiritual pride, the longing for ecstasy replaced by the virtue of steady endurance. Holiness, he realized, was not in brilliance, but in constancy. A historical note often shared among the brothers came to mind. In the medieval autumn, fire was a communal blessing. The monks gathered in the calefactory, their only heated room, sharing warmth and the scent of smoke and ash that clung to their robes. For Theodore, that aroma became a symbol of fraternity, the comfort of shared endurance. It reminded him that even in the coldest season, the body could be warmed by brotherhood and the soul by charity. The story Theodore began to notice during this slow transformation of season was that of Brother Anselm, the abbey's clockmaker, caretaker of its rare water clocks and hourglasses, a man renowned for his mechanical patience and his faith in the ordered rhythm of the universe. Anselm often said that just as a clock must be recalibrated to adapt to the changing seasons and keep time faithfully, so too must the soul adjust its discipline to resist the melancholy and distraction brought by the cold. It was an art of fine-tuning rather than rigid control, a balance of precision and humility. Theodore found comfort in the coarse wool of the thicker habit distributed for winter. Its dense texture and soft warmth became for him a tactile reminder of divine protection, the charity of God woven into cloth, wrapping him in the invisible warmth of fraternity. Through this simple sense of touch, he strengthened his awareness of belonging and security, an emotional defense against the quiet sadness of the season. At Father Silvestra's urging, he increased the rhythm of his inner repetition. The short Jesus prayer murmured like the steady trickle of a fountain that keeps the earth from freezing solid. Each cycle of words became a gentle flow of warmth, a spiritual heat sustaining him through the creeping cold of both body and spirit. The discipline of repetition turned the mind's winter into prayerful motion. He reflected, too, on a small historical curiosity that had become part of monastic life each autumn: the change in diet. As fresh crops vanished, the brothers consumed more roots, grains, and dried fruits, and the air sometimes carried the sweet, spiced aroma of mulled wine used medicinally. Theodore savored the modest sweetness of a dried fig or apple slice as a controlled pleasure, an offering of gratitude rather than indulgence, a brief, sacred reminder that moderation was its own form of worship. At dusk, he often lingered before the communal hearth, watching the dance of firelight flicker across rough stone and brick. The controlled motion of the flames, lively yet contained, became a visual meditation, a living parable of inner zeal and charity, the divine fire that must burn without consuming. Outside, the cold spread through the cloisters, but within, this gentle light restored his sense of balance and serenity. He also drew inspiration from Brother Philippe, the librarian monk, who spent long mornings gently blowing the dust from ancient manuscripts, a faint scent of parchment, mold, and age that mingled with the chill. Philippe's careful devotion to knowledge turned even the act of dusting into an expression of love and contemplation. From him, Theodore learned to shift his focus from personal struggle to humble service, realizing that the surest path to peace was usefulness guided by love. When night fell, he listened to the soft friction of straw beneath him as he lay on his simple bed. That quiet, tactile sound, the rustle of poverty freely chosen, reminded him of the transience of comfort and the endurance of faith. As the cool breath of night spread through his cell, he closed his eyes, feeling surrounded not by loneliness, but by belonging. His heart was calm, his spirit steady, the slow, silent fruit of perseverance ripened by the gentle passing of the seasons. Theodore's long cycle of discipline and contemplation was entering its final phase, a season of inward gathering, a quiet consolidation of lessons learned, much like nature preparing for its deep winter sleep. The air at Saint-Grégoire Abbey had grown cold and heavy, and when sunlight broke through, it was faint and silvery, casting a solemn calm over the cloisters. The atmosphere itself seemed to invite reflection, a still, luminous waiting for the peaceful end of his long inner struggle. He began revisiting the physical elements of his discipline, recalling the rough touch of the hair shirt he wore in moderation, the cool smoothness of the cloister's stone beneath his fingers, and the contrasting warmth of human skin, the frail hands of the sick he had tended in the infirmary. In that tactile contrast between austerity and compassion, he recognized the balance that defined true purification: rigor toward oneself, mercy toward others. It was a wisdom learned not through theory, but through touch. The familiar blend of beeswax and incense that filled the chapel had become a fragrance of belonging rather than distraction. What once stirred his senses now anchored them. It was the scent of faith, a soft reminder of his monastic identity and the vows that had shaped his life. Each breath carried him back to the serenity of his first promise: purity in service, devotion in stillness. He revisited the memory of Father Silvestra's humility, the elder monk's quiet confession of his own youthful struggles. That recollection dissolved any lingering pride. It reminded Theodore that holiness was not freedom from weakness, but companionship within it, a shared human fragility met with divine mercy. In that awareness, he found a serene acceptance of imperfection, a peace deeper than triumph. He deepened his recitation of the Jesus Prayer, repeating it in a steady, unbroken rhythm. The words flowed through him like a soft undercurrent of sound, filling the inner silence so that neither temptation nor despair could take root. This gentle repetition became his final act of vigilance, the steady breath before rest, the melody of peace within his soul. The dim, diffused light in the scriptorium forced him to slow his work. Each stroke of the quill demanded full attention, each line of ink a deliberate act of patience. What might have seemed an inconvenience became a grace. Slowness itself turned into prayer. The careful motion, guided by the texture of parchment and the weight of his hand, kept his mind from wandering and drew him back to the sacred precision of humility. In his evening walks, he contemplated the visual harmony of the monastery, the bare stone walls, the identical habits, the repeating pattern of narrow windows. Their quiet symmetry spoke to him of order and renunciation, a beauty born of restraint. The simplicity of it all was a final visual lesson, a serene antidote to the worldly images of abundance and excess that sometimes drifted through memory. He thought of one last historical curiosity. In medieval winters, books and scrolls had to be handled frequently to prevent mold and insects from destroying them. The dry texture of parchment and the faint scent of age reminded him that even knowledge required constant care. In that simple act, brushing dust from an old page, he saw the metaphor clearly. Purity of soul, like fragile parchment, must be tended daily, or it would decay unnoticed. Finally, as he held a plain wooden chalice, he felt the subtle chill of its metal rim against his skin. That simple, tactile moment grounded him completely in the physical world, the world of tools, of work, of steady faith. It was a closing symbol of moderation, a quiet anchor before peace. And as he stood in the fading light, Theodore knew that the long discipline of his soul had led him not to ecstasy, but to something greater, the calm, enduring grace of rest. Theodore drew upon the memory of his mentor's voice, its calm tone and gentle cadence, as a balm against any whisper of self-condemnation that might rise within him. What had once been mere recollection now became medicine. The past turned into support, counsel transformed into an anchor of peace in the present moment. He reflected on his journey to the village of Vernou, remembering the sensory contrast of that world, the sharp scent of the market, the hum of the crowd, the coarse feel of coins between his fingers. Those memories, once distractions, now symbolized victory over dispersion. He had managed to carry his discipline into the heart of noise and temptation, proving to himself that inner peace, once cultivated, could travel anywhere. The coarse barley bread he ate at his simple meals, its dry texture and faint earthy taste, became both an act of humility and a meditation. The scent of grain, the taste of restraint, the roughness on his tongue, all were reminders that true satisfaction came not from pleasure, but from nourishment of the soul. Each bite was an affirmation that contentment lay in simplicity, a final exercise of palate and will. He recalled the monastic custom of lectio divina, the slow, meditative reading of scripture in a low, rhythmic voice, almost a whisper that filled both scriptorium and cell like a continuous prayer. Theodore adopted that same cadence in his own study, letting sound become devotion, word become breath. The act of reading transformed into prayer itself, the pure essence of monastic recollection. He often pondered the paradox between the rough touch of the hair shirt and the gentle warmth of the infirmary's compassion. Both, he realized, were forms of discipline, one of the body, the other of the heart. Sanctity required both edges of the blade, the firmness of penance and the tenderness of charity. To hold them in balance was to walk the narrow path between pride and despair, the final adversaries of peace. The dense autumn air that wrapped around the abbey was no longer an obstacle, but an ally, a cool, steady companion that kept his senses sharp and his imagination contained. The chill of the stone, the crispness of the air, these sensations became reminders of order and purity, subtle proofs that the world itself mirrored the clarity he had sought within. He often thought of the abbot of Saint-Grégoire, who was known to spend the final hour of each day walking alone through the cloister, fingers brushing the stone walls as he murmured prayers of forgiveness for the day's faults. That quiet ritual became, for Theodore, a symbol of lifelong vigilance, the humility required until the very end. In his mind, he joined the abbot's path, feeling beneath his fingertips the same cool, grainy texture of stone that had witnessed his own transformation. His heart felt light, his mind still. The silence of the abbey at night no longer pressed upon him as emptiness, but enveloped him as peace, a gentle order he himself had helped to build. In that quiet, he heard the harmony of perseverance and grace. The stillness was not absence, but fulfillment, the final tender testimony of victory over anguish. It was the hour of Compline, the final prayer of the day, and the night at Saint-Grégoire Abbey was wrapped in a silence so complete it felt alive. It was no longer the silence of emptiness, but of peace and order, a soft sound of stillness that cloaked the monk like a protective mantle after the storm of youth and restlessness. Kneeling in the dark chapel, Theodore felt the cold of the stone beneath his knees, familiar, grounding, no longer harsh. It was the neutral touch of matter, a final tactile reminder of humility and penance, yet also a symbol of the steadfast faith he had built within himself. That chill had become an ally, as constant and trustworthy as grace itself. The scent of old incense and beeswax lingered in the air, a fragrance of sanctity and permanence. He breathed deeply, turning the act of inhaling into a quiet, wordless prayer of gratitude. The aroma anchored his thoughts, dissolving any remnants of anxiety or stray temptation that might still flicker in the mind's corners. The flicker of altar candles sent long, gentle shadows dancing across the vault. To Theodore, those moving shapes became a living metaphor, a farewell to his former turmoil. The shadows seemed like ghosts of old fears and desires, swaying briefly before fading completely into the steady light of the altar flame. He recalled, without summoning them explicitly, the earliest images of his journey, the serene face of Father Silvestre, the coarse texture of his first hair shirt, and understood that both the wisdom of his mentor and the discipline of his body had guided him toward liberation. As he joined his brother's chant, a soft unison of voices filling the chapel, he felt a quiet warmth of gratitude and belonging. The feel of his wooden rosary between his fingers was one of reassurance now, no longer struggle. Each bead carried the rhythm of the Jesus prayer whispered within, a steady inner current that lulled his mind into calm vigilance, a sign that peace had replaced battle, that his will and grace were now in harmony. A gentle reflection wove through him. His long struggle had not been wasted. It had shaped his spirit, deepened his faith, and taught him that divine mercy reveals itself most clearly through patience with human frailty. In humility, he had found victory. In surrender, strength. Rising from prayer, he walked slowly back to his cell. The faint chill of the corridor stone, the moist scent of earth drifting in from the garden, all of it felt perfectly ordered, perfectly real. This simple sensory world was the natural setting for his peace, the quiet counterpoint to the chaos that had once haunted the beginnings of his vocation. A final image formed in his mind, a small boat, once tossed by storms of thought and desire, now gliding into a still harbour. The night silence was its safe anchorage, the abbey its calm sea. Theodore saw himself as that boat, anchored in faith, guarded by discipline and brotherly charity, ready at last for rest, renewal, and the deep, quiet sleep of grace. As Theodore lay down on his simple straw bed, he felt the coarse wool blanket against his skin, a Spartan comfort that embodied both renunciation and contentment. The soft rustle of the fabric became a murmur of gratitude for the simplicity and safety of his life, easing him into a state of quiet relaxation and serene trust. The night silence within the abbey was no longer emptiness, but a pulse of peace. He could hear the faintest sounds, the steady breathing of his brothers in nearby cells, the whisper of wind along the eaves, the distant drip of the fountain. And in those ordered sounds, he recognized the rhythm of his own pacified soul, a harmony that carried him gently toward dreamless sleep. He focused on the faint trace of incense and beeswax clinging to his habit, the last fragrance of sanctity before his eyes closed. That sacred scent became a protective shield, a quiet assurance that the gates of his mind would stay shut against intrusive thoughts or temptation, a final, olfactory prayer of peace. The culmination of his long journey was not a moment of grandeur, but a soft realization, the unconditional acceptance of his imperfect humanity and a complete trust in divine mercy. Peace, he now understood, was not born of perfection but of patient love, the love that meets struggle with compassion rather than judgment. He pictured the chapel's single candle, a steady flame in the surrounding dark. That point of light became his final image, a visual symbol of constancy and faith, proof that the flame of belief endures even through the deepest night. His discipline, he thought, was the wax that sustained it. In that image, he found stillness and unshakable safety. The truth he carried within was simple. Discipline was never meant to deny life, but to channel it, to shape its energy into charity and service. Purity was not the absence of weakness, but the humility to acknowledge it and the courage to persevere. That was the essence of Father Silvestra's wisdom and the quiet genius of St. Benedict's rule: moderation, balance, and grace. He felt the cool breath of night upon his skin and the gentle warmth of a spirit at rest. That play of opposites, cold and warmth, effort and peace, mirrored the harmony he had achieved between discipline and faith. With a clear mind and a light heart, he closed his eyes, ready for the restorative rest that holiness and service had earned him. His Jesus prayer, now an almost unconscious whisper, blended seamlessly with his breathing, the final cadence before sleep. In that merging of devotion and life's simplest rhythm, his prayer became perpetual, his surrender complete. He saw himself as a single grain of sand in the vast ocean of mercy, and the humility of that vision freed him from every lingering worry. He drifted into sleep with a sense of peace that was the sweetest fruit of his long, silent battle against the shadows of the mind, a sleep of renewal and quiet grace. Until tomorrow, traveler, I'll be waiting to journey with you through these forgotten ages once more. You already know where to find me, right here, between history and dream. Like this video, subscribe to the channel and rest well, traveler.